Fatal invitation, a dinner that led to deadly consequences. Criminal story. Oliver Pierce had always been a man of routine. He was the kind of person who found comfort in predictability and a sense of security in the familiar. His life was orderly, straightforward, and he liked it that way. As a senior associate at a prestigious law firm, Oliver's days were filled with paperwork, meetings, and cases that required a level of precision and discipline that suited his personality. He was methodical in his approach to both his work and his personal life. His colleagues often described him as reliable, calm, and professional. He was the one people turned to when things got complicated, when decisions needed to be made with clarity and reason. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. His apartment, a sleek, modern space in the heart of the city, mirrored his personality. It was minimalist in design, with clean lines, neutral tones, and no unnecessary distractions. Everything had its place, from the bookshelves neatly arranged by author to the polished granite countertops in the kitchen. There was no room for chaos in Oliver's life, and he liked it that way. On weekends, he would typically unwind by catching up on reading, watching the occasional sports game, or simply enjoying the peace and solitude of his apartment. It was his sanctuary, a space where he could decompress after the demanding hours of work. When Linda White, a colleague from the firm, invited him to dinner at her house, it was an invitation that seemed as benign and unremarkable as any other. Linda wasn't someone Oliver considered a close friend, but she was a familiar face at work. They had known each other for years, sharing a professional camaraderie that was functional but never particularly personal. Linda was smart, ambitious, and hardworking, traits that Oliver admired. Yet he always sensed there was something about her that was a little off. She was intense, perhaps a bit too eager to prove herself in the cutthroat world of law. Oliver had always found her attempts at climbing the corporate ladder a little uncomfortable, especially since he had never been one to rush or play games to get ahead. Oliver didn't think much of the invitation at first. It was a casual affair, a dinner to which Linda had extended the same invite to a handful of their colleagues. The firm had a culture of after-hours socializing, occasional happy hours, and networking events, so Oliver thought nothing of it. He accepted the invitation without hesitation, seeing it as an opportunity to unwind and mingle with his coworkers outside of the office. After all, who could say no to a free meal and some light conversation? On the evening of the dinner, Oliver arrived at Linda's house just after 7 p.m. The neighborhood was charming, lined with old brownstones and quiet, tree-lined streets. Linda's home was a small, two-story townhouse that seemed to reflect her personality, charming but with an underlying intensity. The exterior was painted in a rich, deep color, and the front garden had an array of plants that looked carefully cultivated, each one meticulously chosen and placed. It was the kind of house that said, "I have taste," but in a way that didn't scream for attention. It was subtle, the kind of place you could easily imagine someone like Linda inhabiting. Oliver rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, the door swung open to reveal Linda, her expression warm but slightly strained, as though she were trying a little too hard to make everything perfect. "Oliver, you made it," she exclaimed, ushering him inside. She wore a brightly colored dress that contrasted with the darker tones of the house, and her smile seemed forced. "Thanks for the invite, Linda. This place is great," Oliver said, stepping into the entryway and slipping off his coat. He admired the way the space was arranged, tasteful artwork on the walls, elegant furniture, and soft lighting that created a warm and inviting atmosphere. It felt like the kind of home where everything had been thought out carefully, and yet there was a small tension in the air that Oliver couldn't quite pinpoint. "Please, make yourself at home," Linda said, guiding him into the living room where few other colleagues had already gathered. They exchanged pleasantries, chatting idly about work and the recent changes at the firm. Linda introduced Oliver to a couple of new faces, colleagues he hadn't interacted with much before. Everyone seemed pleasant enough, but Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. It wasn't the people or the conversation. It was just a sense, a nagging instinct that told him the night was going to take an unexpected turn. The evening unfolded like many of these social events did. Light, pleasant, and somewhat predictable. Wine was poured, appetizers were passed around, and the conversation drifted from the latest case Oliver was working on to jokes about the firm's partners and their eccentricities. There was an easy camaraderie, with laughter punctuating the conversations. But as the night wore on, Oliver began to notice subtle changes in Linda's behavior. At first, it was the way she had started drinking more heavily than usual. She was sipping her wine faster, more frequently, and there was a slight flush to her cheeks that suggested the alcohol was beginning to affect her. Oliver wasn't a heavy drinker himself, but he had noticed that Linda wasn't one to shy away from a glass or two, especially when she was trying to impress people. It was a bit of a defense mechanism, he thought, an attempt to seem more at ease, more fun in front of her colleagues. But as Linda's drinking increased, so did the tension in her demeanor. The more she drank, the more restless she became, and the more Oliver felt the shift. Her laughter no longer felt natural. It was forced, almost manic, and her smile seemed like something she had to concentrate on in order to maintain. Linda was always intense, but tonight, she seemed to be operating on another level, a level that Oliver didn't fully understand. Around 9 p.m., the dinner was served. Linda had prepared an elaborate meal: roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and a fresh salad, followed by a rich chocolate mousse for dessert. The food was excellent, and the guests all complimented her cooking. But even as they ate, Oliver could sense that Linda wasn't fully present. Her mind seemed to be elsewhere, and when she did engage in conversation, it was often with an edge. There was a sharpness to her words, a tone that Oliver had never heard before. It wasn't malicious, exactly, but it was pointed, and it made him uneasy. As the night progressed, Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She went from being the gracious hostess to someone who was visibly agitated. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were looking for something, or perhaps avoiding something. It was only when she finally spoke up, during a lull in the conversation, that Oliver realized just how far the evening had veered off course. "You know," Linda began, her voice suddenly much more serious, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About work. About everything." The others, who had been enjoying their wine and chatting, fell quiet. Oliver didn't know where this was going, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Something was about to happen. "Oliver, you think you're so much better than the rest of us, don't you?" she said, her voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. Her words were sudden, and they hit Oliver like a punch to the gut. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward Linda. For a moment, Oliver couldn't respond. He had always prided himself on being a good colleague, someone who worked hard and kept his personal feelings separate from his professional ones. He had never considered himself better than anyone else at the firm. But Linda's accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. "What are you talking about, Linda?" he asked, his voice strained but trying to maintain composure. "I don't know where this is coming from." But Linda wasn't done. The alcohol had loosened her tongue, and the anger she had been harboring for so long was now spilling out. "I know what you've been doing, Oliver," she continued, her voice rising. "You've been sabotaging me at every turn, trying to make me look incompetent, trying to ruin my career." Oliver felt his blood run cold. He could barely process the words. What was she saying? He had never sabotaged anyone, least of all Linda. He had always tried to be professional, to stay out of petty office politics. But Linda wasn't finished. She was just getting started. "You think you can get away with it, don't you?" she accused, her eyes narrowing. "You've been undermining me at every turn, stealing my opportunities, making me look like the fool. I can see it, Oliver. I can see what you've been doing." The room was silent, and Oliver could feel the weight of the accusation bearing down on him. He tried to speak, to deny it, but the words caught in his throat. Linda wasn't listening. She was too far gone, her anger and resentment bubbling to the surface in a way that Oliver couldn't understand. What had started as a simple dinner had quickly become something darker, something neither of them could control. As Linda's voice grew louder and more insistent, Oliver realized that this night, this seemingly innocent dinner, wasn't going to end the way he had expected. He had been comfortable in his little bubble, his controlled world, But now that world was beginning to unravel, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tension in the room was palpable, and Oliver's mind raced. What had just happened? One moment, everything had been fine. The evening was flowing smoothly. People were chatting, and the food was excellent. And then, in an instant, Linda had turned the atmosphere on its head. Her words stung with a kind of fury that he hadn't expected. "You've been sabotaging me at every turn," she had said, her voice trembling with anger. "You think you're untouchable, but I know your secrets." He stood there, frozen, his mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. His first instinct was to dismiss it as the ramblings of a woman who had had too much to drink, but the look in her eyes, the sharpness in her tone, it wasn't just alcohol talking. There was something deeply personal in her words, something that Oliver couldn't ignore. Linda had never been a close friend. They had always been cordial at work, and while their relationship was professional, there was a certain underlying tension between them. She was competitive, driven, and ambitious in a way that sometimes made Oliver uncomfortable. He had always suspected that she viewed him as a rival, but he had never thought it would escalate to something like this. He had never been the kind of person who played office politics or engaged in petty one-upmanship. For Oliver, work was simple. Do the job well, keep your head down, and eventually, the recognition would come. Linda, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on competition. It wasn't enough for her to succeed. She had to be the best. Oliver had never understood that kind of ambition. He didn't see the need to climb over others to get ahead, and he certainly didn't see Linda as a threat. He had always believed that the work itself, the merit of one's efforts, would determine success. But now, standing in Linda's living room with her accusations hanging in the air, Oliver felt like he was caught in a trap of her making. She had painted him as the villain, as the person who had intentionally tried to bring her down, to make her look incompetent. And no matter how hard he tried to reason with himself, a small part of him began to question if there was any truth to what she was saying. His thoughts were interrupted by Linda's voice, now louder, more insistent. "I've seen it, Oliver," she said, her words sharp, cutting through the air between them. "You've been trying to get me fired, to push me out of the firm. And don't think I don't know what you've been doing behind closed doors, whispering to the partners, pretending to be all innocent while you sabotage everyone around you." Oliver's stomach dropped. The room had gone eerily silent, the other guests watching in stunned silence as Linda's accusations grew more intense. He felt a knot tightening in his chest. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've never tried to sabotage you. I don't even know what you're talking about." He could feel his pulse quicken, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Linda's face twisted with contempt. She leaned in, her voice low and venomous, as if she were trying to force the truth from him. "You think I don't know? You think I don't see what's been going on? I've been working with you long enough to know what you're really like, Oliver. You're just like everyone else here, out to protect your own career, no matter who you have to crush to get ahead." Oliver had never felt more exposed in his life. For a moment, the walls of Linda's well-kept house seemed to close in around him. The air was thick with tension, and he struggled to breathe. "I don't know what you think you know, but this is crazy," he said, the words tumbling out of his mouth, desperate to regain control of the situation. "I'm not out to get you. I've never done anything to you." Linda let out a bitter laugh, and it sent a chill through Oliver. It was a laugh that was equal parts disbelief and anger, as if she couldn't even comprehend how he could be so blind. "You're not out to get me? You're telling me you don't know what you've been doing?" She gestured around the room as if trying to encompass everything, as if the very air was evidence of her theory. "You think I didn't notice the little things? The way you always get the projects I want, the way the partners always take your side, the way you've been getting ahead while I've been left behind? You've been undermining me every step of the way, Oliver." The words stung, but there was something in Linda's eyes that caught his attention. They were no longer just filled with rage, they were also filled with something else. Pain. Linda wasn't just angry. She was hurt. She felt betrayed. Oliver's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. He had never seen Linda like this, never seen her so vulnerable. She was always so composed, so confident in her own skin. But now, standing in front of him, she looked like someone who had been wounded by something she couldn't control. Oliver felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Had he unknowingly done something to contribute to this? He had always focused on his work, kept his head down, and tried to avoid office drama. But Linda's accusations suggested that he had somehow been a part of the very thing she hated. Had his success, his quiet rise through the firm, made her feel overshadowed? Had his indifference to office politics made her feel isolated and powerless? The guilt gnawed at him, but the anger was still there, simmering just below the surface. "I never meant to make you feel that way," he said, his voice quieter now, more reflective. "But I don't know what you're talking about. If you feel like I've been undermining you, that's not something I did on purpose." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Don't patronize me, Oliver." Her tone was cold now, distant. "I'm not some naive little girl who doesn't see what's going on. I've been working with you long enough to know when someone's playing games. And you've been playing games, haven't you?" Oliver didn't know how to respond. The words stuck in his throat, but his mind was racing, trying to figure out how they had ended up here. He had never intended to hurt Linda, and the idea that he had unknowingly caused her pain, let alone ruined her career, felt like a punch to the gut. But in the back of his mind, another thought began to take root, a darker, more dangerous thought. What if Linda was right? What if he had been so caught up in his own pursuit of success that he had missed the subtle ways in which he had inadvertently undermined her? What if the way the partners favored him, the way he had quietly advanced at the firm, was the result of an environment that didn't care for anything other than results, no matter the cost? Was it possible that, without realizing it, he had become part of the very system Linda despised, the system that rewarded ruthlessness and ambition without regard for the consequences? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This wasn't the time for self-reflection. The moment was slipping out of his control, and Linda was still going on, her voice growing louder, more frantic with each passing second. She was no longer just accusing him. She was pleading for him to understand, as though by getting him to acknowledge her pain, she could somehow right the wrongs she believed had been done to her. "I know everything, Oliver," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know about the things you've done to climb to the top. You've been destroying me every chance you get, and I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore." Her words were a sharp, bitter echo in his ears, and Oliver suddenly felt like the walls were closing in on him. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had never thought of Linda as someone capable of this level of intensity, of this kind of animosity. But now, looking at her, he realized that he had underestimated her. She wasn't just angry, she was desperate. Desperate for validation, for acknowledgement, for recognition in a world that had never seemed to notice her. And in her mind, Oliver had become the person standing in her way, the one who had unknowingly taken the spotlight, leaving her to feel invisible. His pulse quickened, and his hands began to shake. He couldn't understand why Linda was doing this, why she was accusing him of things that didn't make sense. But he could feel the weight of her words, the way they pressed down on him, pushing him further into a corner. At that moment, he realized something: he was no longer in control. This wasn't just about dinner or a few misplaced words. This was about power, about control, about a struggle for dominance in a world where the rules were rarely clear. He had always played by the rules, kept his head down, but now, for the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable, exposed. And then, in the silence that followed, he understood. Linda wasn't just trying to destroy him. She was trying to destroy herself, trying to force the world to recognize her, to see her, to acknowledge her worth. And in that moment, it dawned on Oliver. This had never been about him at all. Oliver felt his heart pounding in his chest as Linda's words echoed in his mind. The accusations had come like a storm, swift and without warning, each one landing with the force of a hammer strike. The world around him seemed to blur and distort, and the air in the room had turned suffocating. The laughter and chatter of the dinner guests seemed distant now, as if the noise had been swallowed up by the overwhelming weight of Linda's anger. He looked around at his colleagues, their faces frozen in shock. They were waiting for him to say something, anything, but the words refused to form on his lips. Linda, however, was relentless. She was pacing now, her movements frantic as her emotions surged and crashed like waves against the shore. "You think I'm just going to sit back and let you ruin me?" she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've been trying to bring me down from the moment we started working together. I see through your little act, Oliver. I know exactly what you're doing." Oliver's mind spun as he tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just a heated argument. It was something far more dangerous, a confrontation that had quickly escalated from a friendly dinner to something deeply personal, something beyond his control. He had tried to remain composed, tried to dismiss the accusations as a drunken outburst, but there was something in Linda's eyes, something raw and desperate, that told him this was no mere outburst. This was a reckoning. His breath became shallow as he felt himself slipping. The reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just an awkward dinner party. It was an ambush. Linda's rage was no longer just about the firm or their careers. It was about him, about what she perceived as his betrayal. She believed he had systematically sabotaged her, that he had been working behind her back to push her out. But Oliver couldn't understand it. He had never seen himself as someone who played those kinds of games, especially not with Linda. He had always been a professional, committed to doing his job without involving himself in petty office politics. But now, in the face of Linda's fury, something inside him began to shift. Her accusations, however baseless they might have seemed, had found a crack in his armor. He wasn't used to being challenged, let alone accused so harshly. At work, he was respected, even admired for his cool-headed professionalism and his ability to navigate complex situations with ease. But here, in Linda's living room, he was losing control. And the more he tried to explain himself, the more Linda seemed determined to paint him as the villain. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you?" Linda's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "You've destroyed me, and now you want to pretend like it's nothing. But I won't let you get away with it." Her words were like needles, each one piercing deeper into Oliver's conscience. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His mind was a whirlwind, each thought colliding with the next in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. His usual calm, measured demeanor was slipping away, replaced by a confusion he hadn't anticipated. Linda's accusations had shaken him to the core. What if she was right? What if, by virtue of his own quiet ambition, he had inadvertently contributed to her downfall? What if his success at the firm had come at her expense, even if that wasn't his intention? The more he thought about it, the more the doubt crept in, gnawing at him, until he couldn't separate truth from paranoia. He took a step back, trying to distance himself from the situation, to think. His mind was clouded, and he was struggling to regain control of his emotions. The last thing he wanted was to lose his temper, to give in to the anger that was simmering just below the surface. But Linda wasn't making it easy. Her words were like a bludgeon, each one striking with a brutal force that left him reeling. "Don't walk away from me, Oliver," Linda said, her voice low and dangerous. She had stopped pacing and was now standing directly in front of him. Her eyes were locked on his, her expression intense and unwavering. "You're not going to walk away from this. Not after everything you've done." There was a moment of silence, a tension so thick that Oliver felt like he couldn't breathe. The world seemed to slow down, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about career politics anymore. This was about Linda's belief that her world had been destroyed, and she was looking to him as the cause. The pain in her eyes was undeniable, but so was the anger. It was an anger that seemed to have built up over years, years of resentment that had now come to the surface in an explosive outburst. And then, as if on instinct, Oliver found himself doing something he hadn't expected. His hand reached out, grabbing Linda by the shoulders. His grip was firm, but not gentle. There was a surge of emotion in him, anger, frustration, confusion, that drove him to act before he could think. Linda's eyes widened in shock, but her expression quickly shifted to one of defiance. "You think you can control me?" she hissed, her voice thick with venom. "You think you can intimidate me?" "I'm not afraid of you, Oliver." He could feel her body tense beneath his hands, the way she fought against him, pushing back, her energy like a live wire. It was clear now that they were both on the edge, too far gone to simply talk their way out of this. There was a darkness in Linda's eyes, a dangerous intensity that made Oliver realize how far the situation had escalated. His pulse was racing, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins made everything feel surreal. He had always been the one in control, the calm, rational figure who could solve any problem with a clear head. But now, here in Linda's living room, with her accusations hanging in the air like an electric charge, Oliver felt powerless. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. He wasn't used to having his entire professional identity questioned, torn apart by someone who had once seemed so ordinary, so driven. Suddenly, Linda wrenched herself free from his grasp, stumbling backward, and in the chaos, her hands found the countertop. Oliver barely had time to react before she grabbed something from the kitchen. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the glint of a knife in her hand, the blade catching the light like a cold, dangerous promise. "You don't get to control me anymore, Oliver," she shouted, the knife raised in the air as if to defend herself. Her voice was no longer filled with the calculated anger of a woman who had been holding in her resentment for years. Now, she was frantic, desperate, driven by a primal need to lash out, to fight back against the man she believed had destroyed her. Oliver's mind went blank. Everything he had known about himself, about his life, suddenly felt like it was slipping away. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had never been in a physical confrontation with anyone, especially not in a setting like this, a dinner with colleagues, surrounded by people who were watching every move, every gesture, every word. In the moment that followed, everything seemed to happen at once. There was no time to think, only to act. Instinctively, Oliver lunged forward, reaching for Linda's wrist. The knife was dangerously close now, and the fear that gripped him in that instant was primal, an instinctive survival mechanism that pushed aside everything else. Linda fought back, her hands slippery with sweat, her eyes wide with fear and anger. The struggle was frantic, a chaotic tangle of limbs and emotions. In that moment, Oliver realized something terrifying. He wasn't just fighting her anger. He was fighting her fear, her need to regain control of a life she felt had been taken from her. And in that same moment, he felt the grip of fear tightening around his chest as well, a growing sense of dread that this night was spiraling into something far beyond their ability to control. The knife clattered to the ground, and Oliver found himself on top of Linda, his hands still gripping her arms as if trying to restrain her. But in the brief second that followed, his world seemed to tilt. There was a sharp pain, and for an instant, everything went dark. Oliver's mind was reeling, a whirlpool of confusion, anger, and panic. For a few moments after the scuffle, everything around him felt muffled, as if the world had been muted, leaving only the harsh beat of his heart in his ears. The living room had grown eerily silent, save for the sound of shallow breathing, his own and Linda's. He had been thrown into a situation he couldn't control, and in the blink of an eye, it had escalated beyond what he could have ever anticipated. He had known that Linda's accusations could hurt, but he had never imagined that this night would lead to violence, to something so primal and raw. He stood over her, the overwhelming scent of panic in the air, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. His eyes were locked on Linda, who was still on the ground, clutching her arm, the knife she had wielded now lying several feet away. She was breathing heavily, her face pale and contorted in pain. The sharp, bitter taste of regret flooded his mouth, but it didn't wash away the numbness that was starting to spread through him. For a moment, he simply stood there, paralyzed, unable to comprehend the weight of what had just transpired. He had never intended for any of this. All he had wanted was a normal dinner with his colleagues, an evening to unwind and enjoy some food and company. But now, the room felt like a prison, the walls closing in on him with every passing second. What have I done? The thought repeated in his mind, louder and more desperate with each heartbeat. His mind was racing, scrambling for a way to explain himself, a way to justify his actions. But there was no justification. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, he had crossed a line. He had hurt Linda. He had let the situation spiral out of control to a point where there was no turning back. He took a step forward, his legs shaky, and his eyes flicked down to Linda again. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her face was flushed, her breath shallow and ragged. He saw the pain etched on her features, the physical pain from the scuffle. Yes, but also something deeper, something that spoke of betrayal. Betrayal. That was the word that kept ringing in his ears. It wasn't just about the fight that had just happened. It was the deep-seated betrayal she felt, the belief that he had betrayed her trust, her friendship, her very sense of self-worth. She had accused him of undermining her career, of sabotaging her at every turn. And in that moment, despite the fear gnawing at his gut, Oliver couldn't help but wonder if there was any truth to it. For the first time that night, a wave of guilt surged through him. He had always seen himself as the good guy, the hardworking professional who avoided drama, who focused on results. But as Linda's accusations had unraveled, so too had his perception of himself. What if his success had come at her expense? What if, in his blind pursuit of his own career, he had ignored the quiet signs of Linda's struggles? The thought was unsettling, and he shoved it aside, unable to face it in that moment. His gaze flickered to the door. The others, the guests, his colleagues, were still in the other room, likely unaware of the severity of the confrontation that had just unfolded. The tension between them had been palpable, but no one had expected things to turn violent. His eyes darted back to Linda. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her hands clutching her arm where he had grabbed her. He had been too rough, too forceful, and now there was a cut, small, but enough to draw blood. Oliver's pulse quickened as he saw the blood staining her sleeve. His stomach churned. He had never intended to hurt her. But now, the consequences of his actions were right in front of him. He couldn't take it back. What do I do now? The question repeated itself, a cycle that didn't seem to have an answer. He was no longer in control of the situation.
The rules had changed.
The stakes had escalated. He was trapped in the aftermath of something that had unfolded too quickly for him to process. Should I call for help? His mind flashed to the idea of calling an ambulance or the police, but the thought was terrifying. If he did that, if he admitted what had happened, there would be no going back. Linda would press charges. The truth about what had transpired would come out, and the consequences would be irreversible. His career, his life, everything he had worked for could come crashing down. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew that calling for help was the right thing to do. It was the only thing that could stop the bleeding, the physical and emotional wounds that both he and Linda had suffered. But what about my career? What about my future? He thought about his colleagues, the ones who had been in the other room, unaware of the escalating confrontation. What would they think when they found out? Would they believe Linda's version of events, the one where he was the villain who had attacked her in a fit of rage? Or would they see his side of things, the man who had been accused unjustly, who had been pushed to his breaking point by Linda's unrelenting anger? He felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't the kind of situation he could talk his way out of. Words no longer seemed to matter. The reality of what had happened had begun to set in, and no amount of explanation or justification could change it. He had lost control, and now he was dealing with the aftermath. For a moment, the room seemed to close in on him. He couldn't breathe. His palms were slick with sweat, and his mind was in a fog, struggling to make sense of what had happened. This is not who I am, he thought, desperately trying to hold on to the person he had always seen himself as, the rational, calm individual who could solve any problem. But now, he was no different than the people he had always avoided, those who let their emotions control them, those who lashed out without thinking of the consequences. Suddenly, Linda's voice broke through the haze in his mind. She wasn't shouting anymore. She wasn't angry, at least not in the same way. Her voice was raw, weak. "I never wanted this, Oliver," she said, her words trembling as she spoke. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be heard." Oliver froze, his chest tightening as he realized the depth of the pain she was feeling. She wasn't just angry. She wasn't just seeking revenge. She was broken. She had felt overlooked, pushed aside, humiliated. And for whatever reason, she had projected all of that anger and resentment onto him. The fight wasn't just about their careers or the petty rivalries in the office. It was about something deeper, about two people who had never understood each other, who had never truly seen each other for who they were. And now, that disconnect had torn them both apart. He knelt beside her, his breath still coming in shallow gasps. Her body was trembling, not just from fear, but from the realization that the violence of the night had shattered something far more fragile, the fragile bond they had once shared as colleagues. "I never meant to hurt you," he whispered, the words coming out hoarse, thick with emotion. But Linda didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes hollow, distant. She had been right about one thing. He had never really seen her. Not in the way she needed. Not in the way she deserved. Oliver had spent his life building a career based on results, on being the dependable, steady figure in any crisis. But now, faced with the wreckage of his own actions, he realized that none of it mattered anymore. His career, his status, his reputation, they were meaningless in the face of what had happened. Linda had been right about one thing. He had always been too focused on the game, too focused on the future, to see the people around him. And now, in the worst possible way, he was paying the price for that blindness. As he reached out to help her up, he saw the fear and pain in her eyes, and for the first time in his life, he realized that success, recognition, and control meant nothing if you couldn't maintain the human connections that truly mattered. The rest of the evening had been lost in the violence of the confrontation, but the real damage had been done long before tonight. Now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences and try to figure out what, if anything, could ever be salvaged from the wreckage. For a brief, fleeting moment, Oliver felt like he had regained control over the situation. The chaos that had erupted in Linda's living room seemed to quiet itself, if only for a second, and he could almost pretend that the night had been a bad dream. The tension that had hung in the air was now replaced by a hollow, oppressive silence that smothered every corner of the room. It was a silence so thick that it felt suffocating. He had never imagined it would end like this. He had spent so many years carefully crafting his reputation, building his career from the ground up, always the reliable one, always the professional. He had been so certain of himself, so convinced that the future would unfold according to the plan he had set for himself. But now, standing in the aftermath of the brutal confrontation, Oliver had to ask himself, what was left? Linda had been taken away in an ambulance, her injuries superficial, but the emotional toll far greater than anything physical. He had watched her as the paramedics worked, the realization of what he had done finally sinking in with the weight of 1,000 stones pressing down on his chest. In that moment, Oliver's career, his carefully constructed identity, felt as fragile as a house of cards. And yet, there had been a part of him, the part that feared losing it all, that couldn't let go of the idea that things had to stay the same. That if he just held on tight to the status quo, if he could only fix this somehow, things would go back to normal. He couldn't let everything slip through his fingers, not now. As the night wore on, the first signs of the consequences began to manifest. The other guests had slowly trickled out, leaving one by one, the weight of their quiet departure more telling than any word could have been. They hadn't said anything to him as they left. There were no apologies, no reassurances. Just quiet, nervous glances, the kind that spoke volumes. He was alone now. The house felt cold, empty, and strangely unfamiliar. Linda was gone, and with her, the fragile connection they had once shared, built on years of office camaraderie. No one had seen it coming, not even him. But as he sat down at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them over the smooth surface, Oliver couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. He had done this. He had turned a simple dinner into a catastrophe, and no amount of rationalization could change that fact. He tried to push the guilt aside. This isn't about me, he thought. It's about Linda. It's about her jealousy, her insecurities. She made this personal. She wanted to tear me down, to make me the villain. But even as he tried to convince himself of this, the nagging voice in the back of his mind refused to let him off the hook. He wasn't the victim here. In fact, in the end, it was Linda who had been pushed too far, too hurt, too desperate, and he had only reacted to her outbursts. But now, the way things had unfolded felt like a twisted game of cause and effect, with the line between right and wrong growing more and more blurred with every passing moment. The next morning, Oliver awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly. He groggily reached for it, the reality of the night before still thick in his mind. As he saw the flood of missed calls and messages, a pit formed in his stomach. The media had already caught wind of the incident, and the pressure was mounting. He quickly scanned the messages from his colleagues, and his heart sank. They were all questioning him. Some were supportive, offering help, but most were cold, guarded. Linda's version of events was already spreading like wildfire. There were rumors now, rumors that Oliver had assaulted Linda in a fit of rage, that he had pushed her to the edge and taken matters into his own hands when she had accused him. He had heard the whispers at work before about how Linda had always been volatile, how she had made enemies with everyone she encountered. But now it wasn't just about office gossip. Now it was a full-blown crisis, and Oliver had become the center of it. The false victory, the he had once imagined, the one where he could emerge from this unscathed, with his career intact, had evaporated in an instant. The very thing he had feared most had come to pass. His reputation, built over years of hard work, was now under siege. His colleagues were no longer the friendly faces he had worked beside for so long. Instead, they were scrutinizing him, judging him for what had happened. His professional network was beginning to fracture, and his carefully curated public image was crumbling before his eyes. It wasn't just the office that was affected. The media storm had intensified as well, and Oliver's name was now plastered all over the news. The narrative was clear. Oliver, the trusted colleague, had allegedly attacked Linda in a moment of rage. The truth, however distorted it might be, was no longer relevant. The public had already made up its mind, and it was too late for him to rewrite the story. But there was one thing Oliver hadn't anticipated: how deeply the guilt would gnaw at him. It wasn't just the fact that his career was teetering on the brink. It wasn't even the fear of losing everything he had worked for. It was the nagging, relentless ache in his chest, the knowledge that Linda's pain had been the result of something deeper than office politics or competition. His actions, even if provoked, had caused her emotional harm. And worse, he had failed to recognize the fragility of the human connections around him. He had been so obsessed with his own ambition, with climbing the professional ladder, that he had never considered what it might cost others. Oliver had won the battle to maintain his career, but he had lost the war of integrity, of human connection. He had always believed that success was the ultimate goal, the final measure of a person's worth. But now, as he sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the cold, unfeeling silence of his own failure, Oliver realized that success meant nothing if you destroyed the people who mattered along the way. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his boss. "Oliver, we need to talk. This situation has escalated far beyond what we anticipated. We've had discussions with the HR department, and we're going to have to address this. There may be legal action involved. We'll be in touch soon." The weight of the message hit him like a ton of bricks. It was official now. The investigation would begin. The legal proceedings would start. His career, his future, everything he had worked for was now hanging by a thread. He had spent so long building a life for himself, building an image of the perfect employee, the hardworking, reliable professional. But now, that image was shattered. His reputation was no longer something he controlled. The damage was done. And yet, Oliver couldn't bring himself to fully regret what had happened, at least not in the way he thought he should. He regretted how things had escalated. He regretted how far they had gone. He regretted the violence, the loss of control. But part of him, the part that had always struggled with feeling invisible, that had always felt like he was being overlooked in the corporate world, couldn't help but acknowledge a darker truth. Linda had seen him. She had seen him in a way that no one else had. She had seen the anger, the insecurity, the fear that he had kept buried for so long. She had challenged him, pushed him, and in doing so, had exposed the cracks in his perfect life. In some twisted way, Linda had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had always kept hidden. She had made him see the truth that he had long avoided, that ambition, power, and recognition would never fill the emptiness inside him. It was never about the job. It was never about the promotions, the prestige, or the respect. It was always about proving to himself that he mattered, that he was seen. And now, in his attempt to protect his reputation, he had sacrificed everything else. He had destroyed the very thing he sought to preserve, his humanity. The false victory had come at a cost that he could never undo. The question now was whether there was any redemption left for him, whether there was any way to salvage what remained of his life, or if he was already too far gone. The days after the incident felt like an endless blur, a succession of events that happened too quickly to process and yet, at the same time, too slow to bear. Oliver's life, once so neatly compartmentalized, now lay in a chaotic heap around him. He had woken up that morning, as he had every morning for the past several years, with the same sense of purpose, only to find that his world had shifted irrevocably. The walls of his life, once so carefully constructed, had crumbled in a matter of hours, and he was left to pick through the wreckage, trying to make sense of the damage. The media frenzy had continued unabated, each new report on the incident spinning a darker narrative. His colleagues had distanced themselves, some speaking to him in clipped tones, others avoiding him entirely. His phone had buzzed incessantly with messages, some sympathetic, some accusatory, but none of them were enough to quell the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in his chest. The legal inquiries had begun. Lawyers were calling. Human Resources had sent him a formal letter of suspension. His world, once filled with certainty, had dissolved into uncertainty. But it wasn't the career repercussions that weighed most heavily on him. It was something deeper. He couldn't shake the image of Linda, pale and trembling on the floor, her eyes wide with pain and disbelief. Her blood had stained the kitchen floor, and no matter how hard he tried to wash it away, mentally, emotionally, the stain remained, a dark mark on his conscience. Oliver had always prided himself on being in control, on being the calm, rational one. He had built his life on the idea that if he worked hard enough, stayed focused enough, he could avoid the pitfalls that brought others down. But this was beyond his control. No amount of effort, no amount of striving could undo what had happened. He had reached the peak of his career and, at the same time, plummeted into an abyss of regret and self-loathing. For the first time in his life, Oliver felt utterly powerless. The harsh truth was undeniable. He had crossed a line. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself that it had been self-defense, that he had been provoked by Linda's accusations, he knew better. He had hurt her. He had allowed his anger to override his better judgment, and in that moment, he had made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The sharpest pain wasn't in the thought of losing his job or his reputation. It was the knowledge that he had destroyed something far more precious than either of those, his own integrity. The legal proceedings had begun. Linda's family had filed charges of assault, and despite Oliver's attempts to explain the situation, to frame it as an accident, the evidence, the witnesses, the injuries, spoke for themselves. He was facing the real possibility of criminal charges. His lawyer had suggested a plea deal, but Oliver's mind was far too clouded to make any rational decisions. The guilt, the overwhelming shame, made it difficult to see beyond the moment. What had seemed like a simple altercation, a brief lapse in control, was now unfolding as a tragic, life-altering event that had no easy resolution. As the days turned into weeks, Oliver's sense of isolation deepened. He had been cut off from his colleagues, his once bustling office, now a distant memory. His friends had stopped reaching out, too afraid to be associated with him in the midst of the scandal. And Linda? She was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared from the public eye, retreating from everything, perhaps to heal, perhaps to avoid the barrage of questions and judgment. Oliver couldn't blame her. He had shattered her trust, her career, and maybe even her sense of self. But still, in the quiet of the nights, he couldn't help but wonder, was she okay? It was during one of these late-night moments of self-reflection that Oliver finally understood the depth of the mistake he had made. He hadn't just hurt Linda in that kitchen. He had hurt himself. In his desperation to protect his reputation, to salvage the career he had worked so hard for, he had compromised the very thing that had defined him, his character. In his mind, success had always been the most important thing. If I'm not successful, then what am I? He had often asked himself. But now, as he sat in his empty apartment, staring at the cold, silent phone screen, he realized that his definition of success had been entirely wrong. It was all a facade. He had sacrificed his values, his relationships, and his own peace of mind in pursuit of a goal that had ultimately proven hollow. Linda's accusations had forced him to confront something he had buried deep inside, his own fear of failure, his desperate need to be seen, to be recognized. But in the process, he had burned bridges with everyone who had once trusted him, and most devastatingly, he had betrayed himself. What now? The question loomed over him like a storm cloud. There was no going back, no erasing the past. He couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't undo the damage he had caused. The truth of the matter was that no one would ever see him the same way again. He had gone from being the reliable, trustworthy colleague to being the man who had physically harmed a fellow employee. And that truth, no matter how hard he tried to run from it, would follow him for the rest of his life. There was no such thing as a clean slate. Not anymore. And yet, in the midst of all the despair, something shifted in Oliver's mind. A flicker of understanding began to grow. The loss he had experienced wasn't just about the tangible things, the career, the reputation, the material success. It was about something deeper. It was about the erosion of his soul, his very sense of self. But this realization, though painful, was also a revelation. Maybe this was the cost of living a life that prioritized success above all else. Maybe it had taken this moment, this catastrophic failure, to make him understand that true success wasn't about professional accolades or climbing the corporate ladder. It was about the people you surrounded yourself with, the trust you built, and the integrity with which you lived your life. It was about how you treated others, how you listened, how you showed up for the people who mattered to you. Linda had been right in the end. It wasn't just about work. It was about being human. In his own brokenness, Oliver began to see the full extent of his flaws. He had spent so much time protecting the image he had built that he had forgotten how to truly connect with others. He had treated Linda as a competitor, as a stepping stone in his career, instead of a colleague, a fellow human being who deserved respect, kindness, and empathy. His blindness to her struggles had contributed to the confrontation that ultimately led to her injuries. And as much as he wanted to blame her for pushing him to the edge, he knew the truth. He had allowed himself to be pushed. He had failed to control his emotions, and in doing so, he had ruined not just their professional relationship, but also his sense of self-worth. I can't go back to the way things were, he thought. But maybe I can still change. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Oliver understood now that he couldn't erase the past, but he could learn from it. He could take this shattered version of himself and try to rebuild it slowly, carefully, with honesty and humility. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But it was the only way forward. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead him to something more meaningful than success. It would lead him to redemption. But there were still many questions left unanswered. Would Linda ever forgive him? Would his career ever be the same? Could he ever find peace after what he had done? For now, all he could do was wait for the legal proceedings to unfold. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to make the future better. It was a long, hard road ahead. But for the first time in his life, Oliver understood that it was one he would have to walk, not as the man who had everything to lose, but as the man who had lost everything and had yet to figure out what he might have to gain. The weeks following the legal hearings and the suspension from work were some of the most excruciating of Oliver's life. At first, he had thought he could weather the storm, keep his head down, and eventually return to a version of normalcy. But with each passing day, That sense of normalcy seemed more like an illusion. His world had been irrevocably altered, and no amount of self-justification or rationalization could erase the guilt that gnawed at him. When the case was finally settled, Linda, now physically recovered, had chosen not to pursue criminal charges in exchange for a settlement, a decision that allowed Oliver to avoid jail time. It seemed like an end, but it was really just the beginning of a new chapter. The weight of the resolution was not one of triumph, but of deep, quiet contemplation. As he signed the documents, settling the legal battle that had consumed his life, Oliver found himself wondering whether he had truly learned anything from the ordeal, or if he was simply relieved that the immediate consequences had been averted. The harsh reality was that life did not stop just because you faced a crisis. The world kept turning, the clock kept ticking, and people in time moved on. But for Oliver, there was no escaping the truth that lingered in his mind. The man who walked out of the courtroom was not the same man who had walked in. The months after the settlement passed slowly, and Oliver spent much of his time in quiet reflection. It was a period of isolation, both self-imposed and a result of the fallout from the incident. The whispers around the office had mostly died down, but the disapproving glances from colleagues had not disappeared. He was no longer seen as the dependable, reliable professional. To many, he was now a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, a reminder that beneath the polished surface of any career lay the potential for a breakdown, a crisis of character. But while the world around him had moved on, Oliver had yet to make peace with his own actions. He had returned to his office, now more of a ghost than an active participant. The job was still there, but the joy he once derived from it had dissipated. His colleagues barely acknowledged his presence, and even his closest friends, the ones who had once stood by him, kept their distance. Oliver realized that the relationships he had taken for granted, those bonds that had seemed so secure, had been built on a foundation of pretense. He had allowed his ambitions to overshadow the more human aspects of his life, and now those relationships were fractured beyond repair. It wasn't just the people in the office who had changed. Oliver had changed too, though it was not always a change he could easily articulate. His sense of self, once so tightly bound to his professional achievements, now seemed less certain. He no longer defined himself by his work or his success. In fact, he had come to resent the very thing that had once been the source of his identity. Success, he now understood, had been an illusion, a mask he wore to cover his fear of inadequacy, of being invisible, of not being good enough. But the truth had been revealed, in the most painful way possible, and he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered ego. Every day, Oliver faced a choice. He could continue to cling to the idea of success, of regaining the respect he had lost, or he could embrace a different path, one that was less certain, less comfortable, but ultimately more authentic. The question of whether he could change, whether the lessons he had learned from Linda's accusations, the fight, and the legal proceedings could actually lead to personal growth, loomed large in his mind. Could he rebuild a life that was based on honesty, humility, and connection, or was he forever doomed to repeat the mistakes of his past? The turning point came on a cold, rainy afternoon, months after the settlement, when Oliver found himself face-to-face with an unexpected visitor. It was Linda. He hadn't seen her since the day she had been taken away in the ambulance. He had heard through mutual acquaintances that she was back to work, slowly regaining her footing after the incident. But seeing her now, standing in front of his door, made his heart race in ways he didn't anticipate. She looked different, healthier, though the same guarded expression was still on her face. She wasn't here for reconciliation, he realized. She was here for something else. "Oliver," Linda said, her voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." He hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't considered what it would feel like to face her again. His mind raced for a response, but words escaped him. He simply nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The air between them was thick with the unspoken, the years of tension, the anger, the pain. There was no getting around what had happened. It had all been laid bare. But in that moment, as Linda sat across from him, he finally saw her not as a colleague, not as a rival, but as a human being, a woman who had been deeply affected by his actions, just as he had been affected by hers. "I don't know why I'm here," Linda began, staring at the floor. "Maybe because I need to understand. Maybe because I need to know what happened, why it happened." Oliver's heart clenched. He had never considered the possibility that she might want answers, that she might be seeking some kind of closure. But it was clear now that, in many ways, he hadn't given her the chance to voice her own pain, her own side of the story. He had been too consumed by his own fear, his own shame, to see that Linda, too, had been struggling with demons of her own. "I'm sorry," Oliver said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know what I did to you, and there's no excuse for it. I've spent months thinking about it, trying to understand how I could have let it go that far." Linda remained silent for a moment, her eyes still focused on the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than Oliver had ever heard it before. "You don't get to apologize just because you're sorry, Oliver," she said quietly. "You don't get to erase what happened just by saying sorry. It doesn't work that way." The words stung, but Oliver didn't interrupt. He knew, deep down, that she was right. He couldn't erase the past. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, no matter how much he wished he could. "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The years of tension, the years of professional rivalry, the years of silent resentment, all of it hung in the air between them. But for the first time, Oliver felt the weight of his actions in a way he hadn't before. He realized that Linda's pain was not something he could fix, but something he had to accept. It wasn't about seeking absolution or even forgiveness. It was about facing the reality of what he had done and learning from it. Eventually, Linda stood up, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if we can ever go back to how things were," she said, her voice a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "But I'm not asking you to make it right. I'm asking you to learn from it, to not let this happen again." Oliver nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle deep into his chest. She was right. He couldn't undo the past, but he could take responsibility for it. He could choose to change. As Linda walked out the door, Oliver sat in the silence, the full magnitude of their conversation washing over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was seeing clearly. It was true that the world around him had changed. It was true that he had lost a lot, his career, his reputation, his sense of self. But in the end, he had gained something far more valuable: awareness. He was no longer the same man who had walked into that dinner months ago. He had paid a heavy price, but in doing so, he had learned something essential about himself, about others, and about the cost of ambition. Success no longer seemed like the ultimate goal. It was the relationships you built, the integrity you maintained, and the humility you cultivated that mattered more than any title or paycheck. And though the road ahead was uncertain, though the scars of the past would remain, Oliver finally understood what it meant to be truly free. It wasn't about avoiding failure or protecting your image. It was about accepting responsibility, embracing vulnerability, and, above all, learning to be human. As he sat there, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point, Oliver felt the first glimmer of peace he had felt in a long time. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was his resolution. And that, for now, was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.